July 19, 1940. In the dimmed auditorium of the Kroll Opera House, Adolf Hitler stood before a crowd that had been taught to expect triumph. 6 weeks earlier, Paris had fallen. The British had been chased to the beaches at Dunkirk and dragged off in little boats. Germany's banners flew over a continent that, to many in the Reich, looked beaten and rearranged. In that charged atmosphere, the Führer did something unexpected. He made what he called an appeal once more to reason. He invited Britain, in effect, to accept terms and end the conflict. That sentence, that offer, is the fulcrum of what followed. It was not merely a diplomatic phrase. For Germany's top leaders, it crystallized a hypothesis about how the world worked after rapid victory, that power speaks and losers listen. How they reacted when Britain flat-out refused negotiation did more than produce angry speeches. It exposed fault lines in German strategy, forced choices between branches of service, and set into motion decisions whose consequences would stretch far beyond a failed set piece in an opera house. To understand why the refusal mattered, you need the immediate context. Dunkirk was both humiliation and success, a retreat saved by improvisation. The Wehrmacht had routed the French armies and their allies. For a few weeks in late spring and early summer 1940, the German leadership experienced a mood that mixed elation with expectancy. They expected that Britain, isolated and cut off from a continental ally, would be willing to negotiate terms rather than face occupation or continued bombardment. Publicly, that mood produced celebration. Officers were promoted. Parades reinforced a sense of inevitability. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, recorded in his diary a tone of approval and a belief that momentum had swung decisively toward Germany. Many in the Army and the Luftwaffe read recent events as confirmation of a straightforward theory of war: fast victories, political capitulations. In private, however, the picture was less uniform. Not everyone in Germany agreed that Britain's surrender was a foregone conclusion. The Kriegsmarine's leadership, and Admiral Erich Raeder in particular, spoke plainly about the facts of geography and force. The Channel lay between the German coast and Britain. The Royal Navy remained the largest and most experienced fleet in the world. The Germans did not possess enough purpose-built landing craft for a cross-channel invasion, and improvised solutions, barges, ferries, and hastily adapted vessels could not be counted on in the face of a powerful enemy fleet. Raeder warned that any attempt to force a seaborne invasion without neutralizing the Royal Navy would be perilous. His memorandum and oral warnings to the High Command emphasized the Navy's Achilles heel: the need for control of the sea lanes and sufficient transport capacity to move, protect, and supply invasion forces. These were not minor technical objections.
They went straight to the feasibility of the plan that would later be famous as Operation Sea Lion. The Wehrmacht's apparent command of the continent did not erase the physical reality of a water barrier or the institutional power of a navy that could operate from home bases, project force, and interdict a crossing. The Luftwaffe could try to challenge naval movements, but that introduced a different set of assumptions about the power of air forces to substitute for or negate naval strength. Directive Number 16 was issued as the Reich's answer to these doubts, a preparation for a potential invasion, a blueprint that kept options open while the Germans assessed conditions. For some officers, it read more like a contingency than a committed timetable. It acknowledged limitations and set preparatory tasks rather than promising an imminent landing. That ambiguity mattered because in the weeks that followed, the German leadership divided along institutional lines. The Army and Luftwaffe celebrated the momentum, the Navy urged caution. The debates were technical, but their outcome would be profoundly political. When Britain's response arrived, it was short, formal, and final. Lord Halifax, speaking for the British government, made clear that Britain would not accept negotiations that fell short of freedom for occupied peoples and the restoration of their sovereignty. The message rejected the logic Germany assumed would govern a defeated partner: no pragmatic settlement while Europe remained under German domination. The British position was that peace on German terms would mean the end of the independent nations of Europe. Hitler listened to that reply with fury. His expectation had been that a combination of threat, demonstration of force, and an offer of terms would produce at least a break in resistance. When that did not happen, his reaction was immediate and personal. Yet Hitler's fury did not translate into a unified strategic correction. It exposed different kinds of bewilderment across the German High Command. Halder, writing again in his diary, captured a common exasperation. Britain, he noted, behaved as if, quote, they had lost the war, they just don't know it yet, end quote. It was a line that combined disbelief and calculation. The Germans could not accept that Britain would defy what seemed to them the obvious facts on the ground. That disbelief fed into a new set of directives. Directive number 17 tasked the Luftwaffe with achieving the conditions for Sea Lion by neutralizing the RAF and breaking British morale. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, seized this assignment with public confidence. He believed air power could compel political outcomes. In his view, the Luftwaffe could reduce Britain's capacity and will to resist to a point where negotiation would follow.
The plan that sprang from this belief was both operational and symbolic. Achieve air superiority, neutralize the RAF and the anti-aircraft infrastructure, and prepare conditions that would allow Germany to threaten or even cross the Channel. From German planners' point of view, the logic was clear. Deny Britain its air defense, pressure its political will, and Sea Lion would become possible. From Britain's perspective, however, this logic underestimated critical factors. First among them was geography. To conduct a seaborne invasion, Germany needed not merely air superiority, but the ability to prevent the Royal Navy from interdicting the Channel crossing. The Luftwaffe could contest the skies, but air power could not, by itself, eliminate the Royal Navy's ability to operate. Second, the Luftwaffe's calculations rested on a series of operational assumptions that would prove dangerously optimistic. Operation Adler Day, the day intended to bring the RAF to decisive battle, became the Luftwaffe's litmus test. Planning for Adler Day assumed that the RAF's fighter strength was fragile in the face of sustained and concentrated attacks on airfields, aircraft factories, and radar installations. Göring promised rapid success. Plans were made in terms of massed bomber formations escorted by fighters, with the aim of breaking Fighter Command's ability to mount an effective defense. But the reality of aerial combat over Britain introduced variables the German staff had not adequately weighted. Luftwaffe crews, trained and successful in the skies over France, suddenly faced a different kind of campaign when fighting over enemy territory. When German raids flew across the Channel, any aircraft shot down fell into British hands or the sea, while British pilots downed over their own territory could, if lucky, return to airfields and fly again. The advantage of fighting over home territory, vastly underrated by German planners, mattered in personnel and morale. The Royal Air Force also benefited from a growing network of early warning systems. British radar, the Chain Home system, and the integrated command and control structures under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding gave Fighter Command a real-time edge. Radar did not win the whole battle alone, but it multiplied the effectiveness of limited fighter resources by guiding interceptions and conserving effort. Operational numbers tell the story in blunt terms. On the initial days of the Luftwaffe's concentrated efforts, the Germans could and did inflict losses, but these came at a cost. In one set of early Luftwaffe attacks, the German bomber and fighter formations lost roughly 45 aircraft to British defenses in exchange for something like 13 British losses. Those figures, losses on German sorties more than triple those suffered by British forces in comparable engagements, reflected not only skill and resolve on the British side, but the structural disadvantage of fighting at range and over water.
The Luftwaffe's replacement rates, pilot training pipeline, and recovery of wounded or captured airmen could not match the steady throughput and recuperative advantage of British Fighter Command operating from home airfields. The Germans also misread the political dimension of bombing. There was an assumption within German high command that sustained air attack could force a political capitulation by breaking civilian morale. Göring and others believed that if London and other cities were relentlessly hit, British resolve would unravel. That belief informed a dangerous tactical pivot. When fighter and airfield targets proved resilient, the Luftwaffe turned more emphatically toward bombing urban centers in the hope of demoralizing a population. This shift from attempting to destroy the RAF to punishing cities had two critical consequences. First, it removed Luftwaffe effort from direct pressure on Fighter Command at moments when concentrated attacks on airfields might have tipped the balance. Second, it hardened British resolve. The Blitz, the sustained bombing of London and other cities, did inflict terrible suffering, destroy housing, and kill civilians, yet it also galvanized resistance. Rather than breaking the British will to fight, the Blitz increased political solidarity and public determination to endure. Where German planners had expected terror to produce weakness, they instead contributed to a national response that strengthened Britain's capacity to continue the fight. As the Luftwaffe expended resources and failed to force a decisive collapse of the RAF, Germany's window for a seaborne invasion narrowed. Weather played its part. The Channel was not hospitable to rushed crossings, and bad weather could scuttle even the best-laid plans. Logistical shortfalls, the absence of enough suitable landing craft, remained unresolved. The Royal Navy continued to pose an existential threat to any large-scale crossing. Taken together, these operational realities made the prospects for Sea Lion increasingly dubious. Rather than accept this and pause for comprehensive recalculation, Germany's leadership made another consequential choice. The inability to force Britain to the table, combined with Hitler's political objectives, encouraged a new strategic turn eastward. If Britain could not be knocked out, it seemed plausible to German strategists that a decisive continental victory could remove Britain's ability or will to continue the war. In this reasoning, eliminating the Soviet Union as a potential partner for Britain, or at least removing a major continental adversary, became the path to rendering Britain strategically isolated. That line of thought helped lead to the decision to plan and then launch Operation Barbarossa. Barbarossa's planning was not a simple, direct reaction to Britain's refusal. The decision to attack the Soviet Union had its own ideological logic and long-standing strategic ambitions.
But the refusal to negotiate with Britain made a dramatic difference in the Reich's calculus. If Britain would not accept terms even after the fall of France, then the German leadership concluded, or convinced themselves, that a sweeping victory over the Soviet Union might force Britain into a bargain, or at least remove any potential Eastern threat. The trade-off was stark: divert resources and attention eastward in the hope of breaking Britain's international position, or redouble effort against Britain with still unresolved naval obstacles. The choice to open a massive Eastern front showed how the failure to secure a political settlement with Britain cascaded into a strategic gamble of continental proportions. The Battle of Britain thus sits at the intersection of military calculation and political misreading. Leaders across the German establishment reacted in ways shaped by their institutions and their biases. Göring's hubris about air power made Directive No. 17 believable. Raeder's naval caution highlighted the practical limits of power at sea. Halder's diary entries reveal a mixture of bewilderment and frustrated expectation. Leaders who had tasted victory assumed its logic would continue, and when it did not, they scrambled for new narratives to make sense of the gap. The operational arc from Adler Day to the Blitz demonstrates how misperception can become strategy. Germany misread the texture of British defense. Radar, command integration, pilot resilience, and the political willingness to endure bombing were not marginal factors but decisive ones. The Luftwaffe, having failed to achieve air superiority, shifted to a strategy that arguably prolonged British capacity to resist by diverting German resources into a campaign of terror that hardened British resolve. Sea Lion, for the moment, moved from prospect to suspended plan. The Reich's attention turned east, where the resources needed for a massive ground campaign were gathered at the cost of leaving Britain as an enemy on the flank. That sequence of reactions, confidence, disbelief, escalation, misapplied force, and finally strategic pivot, helps explain why the British refusal to negotiate mattered far beyond a single diplomatic exchange. It revealed the Germans' foundational error, treating other states as rational actors who would give up when defeat seemed clear. Britain's refusal demonstrated that nations do not always behave like rational calculators willing to accept defeat. They may choose to endure, to resist, and to exploit the very advantages that geography and institutions give them. In the case of Britain, durable naval supremacy, resilient air defense, and a political culture willing to continue sustained resistance turned what German planners read as inevitability into a long, costly stalemate. That decision-making cascade had long-term consequences.
By diverting resources eastward and opening the Soviet theater, Germany stretched its logistical capacity and exposed itself to a grinding war of attrition for which its initial victories had not prepared it. The refusal to negotiate with Britain did not by itself cause Germany's defeat, but it performed a catalytic role. It forced German leaders into choices, particularly the murderous, overreaching gamble in the East that reshaped the entire war. Throughout this period, the responses of Germany's top leaders were revealing. Hitler oscillated between fury and grand strategic re-engineering. Göring clung to the promise of air power and then oversaw its misapplication against cities. Raeder insisted on maritime realities, warning of the Royal Navy's capability to frustrate invasion. Halder recorded disbelief and an unsteady confidence that momentum would yet be decisive. Jodl and Keitel, part of the military machinery that translated political direction into operational orders, had to accommodate shifting priorities, preparing invasion plans one moment, allocating men and material elsewhere the next. Those reactions mattered because the machinery of war runs on assumptions. When the assumptions fracture, when the idea that victory guarantees compliance is proved false, the machinery can jam. Germany's leaders found themselves improvising in the face of stubborn resistance. They tried to convert military pressure into political submission, and when that failed, they sought other theaters in which to press their advantage. Each reaction made sense from a limited perspective.
Taken together, they reveal a strategic dissonance, operational overreach in some areas, underestimation of enemy capacities in others, and an ideological impatience that pushed choices towards extreme solutions. It is worth underlining the counterfactuals only as caution, not as claims that a different set of words would have saved history. If Germany had acknowledged the naval and logistical realities earlier, the tempo of its operations would have changed. If the Luftwaffe had maintained focus on neutralizing fighter command rather than shifting to bombing cities, different tactical outcomes might have followed. But such what-ifs cannot erase the essential point. The British refusal to negotiate forced German leaders to test their assumptions against stubborn facts. They failed those tests in ways that redirected the course of the war. By the time the Reich pivoted toward Barbarossa, the moment for a plausible sea lion had passed. Weather, logistics, and British defenses conspired to make an invasion uncertain at best. Instead of recalibrating and building a patient, integrated approach to cross-channel operations, German leaders elected a strategy that assumed a decisive continental victory would alter Britain's calculus. That bet transformed the war into a multi-front conflict that exhausted German resources and opened avenues for alliance against the Reich.
In the end, the manner in which Germany's top leaders reacted when Britain flat-out refused negotiation is a study in the limits of power and the costs of misreading an opponent. Their reactions, ranging from rage to frantic replanning, from overconfidence in air power to uneasy naval counsel, did not merely reflect personality. They exposed structural failures of judgment, a belief that victory on the battlefield readily yielded political capitulation, an underestimation of technological and institutional advantages on the British side, and an ideological impatience that preferred sweeping solutions over incremental consolidation. The refusal to negotiate was not a single act of resistance. It was a mirror held up to German assumptions. It showed that military success does not automatically produce political acquiescence, and that strategic thinking must account for the non-linear ways societies, institutions, and technologies respond to pressure. Hitler's speech in the Kroll Opera House, his appeal once more to reason, anticipated a nod that did not come. That absence forced German leaders into a cascade of reactions: anger, operational miscalculations, and ultimately a decision to open a new front in the East that reshaped the war and set the stage for the long and destructive conflict that followed. If the lesson from this episode is blunt, it is valuable. States and leaders must not treat opponents as mere calculators of pain and reward. Britain's refusal to negotiate was an assertion of political principle and strategic endurance that the German High Command could not easily reconcile with its own momentum. The resulting misreadings carried a strategic cost far beyond a failed diplomatic exchange. If you found this exploration revealing and want a deeper chronological unpacking of how the Blitz and Operation Barbarossa unfolded in the months after these decisions, subscribe for a follow-up where we trace the operational timelines and political debates that carried these choices forward. For now, remember that the way leaders react to refusal, whether with coercion, recalculation, or redirection, can change the face of a war. Britain's flat refusal forced Germany to reveal its limits, and those revealed limits helped determine the war that Europe would endure.